Ethan Caldwell strode through the high-end shopping mall, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floors with quiet authority. At 46, he was a self-made millionaire, a man who had built his fortune from the ground up in the world of luxury real estate. Today, he was here for a brief stop, just another routine business call before heading to a private meeting. His phone pressed to his ear, he spoke with the confidence of a man who had everything. "Yes, Mr. Daniels, the figures align perfectly. The market is in our favor," he said, his tone smooth. He adjusted his cufflinks as he walked, already envisioning the next lucrative deal that would solidify his status. Then, in the middle of the bustling crowd, he saw her. For a moment, the noise of the mall faded into nothing. His breath caught in his throat as his gaze locked onto a woman he never thought he'd see again, his former wife. 15 years had passed since the day he left her behind, convinced that walking away was the best decision for his future. Back then, he had chosen wealth and ambition over the life they had built together. But now, standing just a few feet away, she looked more radiant than he'd ever remembered. Time had not dimmed her beauty. It had refined it. Her smile was warm, her posture poised, and she carried herself with an effortless confidence that sent a pang of something unfamiliar through him. And she wasn't alone. Beside her was a young man, no older than 15. The boy had strong features, dark hair, and a presence that was impossible to ignore. Ethan felt his stomach twist. The resemblance was uncanny, the same sharp jawline, the same determined eyes. His mind raced. Could this boy be his son? A rush of emotions flooded through him. Shock, confusion, regret. He had walked away from his pregnant wife all those years ago, convincing himself that she and the child would be better off without him. He had buried the memory, choosing to focus on his relentless climb to success. Yet here she was, thriving, her life seemingly full without him. And the boy, was he his child? Had he unknowingly passed by his own son countless times over the years without realizing it? His chest tightened as he stood frozen in place. The wealth he had accumulated, the power he wielded, it all suddenly felt empty. He had sacrificed so much in pursuit of success, but in doing so, had he lost the one thing that truly mattered? As he watched them laughing together, an unfamiliar ache settled in his heart. He had spent 15 years believing he had everything. Now, with one chance encounter, he realized he might have lost it all. Ethan Caldwell tightened his grip on the phone, struggling to process what he was seeing. Just moments ago, his mind had been fully engaged in sealing a multi-million-dollar real estate deal. But now, all thoughts of business had vanished. Across the grand shopping plaza, Olivia stood by a decorative fountain, a soft smile on her face as she spoke to a teenage boy. Ethan's breath hitched. The boy's features were unmistakable. His sharp jawline, the way he stood with quiet confidence. It was like looking into a mirror of his younger self. A voice crackled through the phone, pulling him back to the present. "Mr. Caldwell? Are we still on the same page?" Mr. Daniels sounded impatient. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind had suddenly rewound 15 years, back to the day Olivia had told him she was pregnant. He had convinced himself that leaving was the right choice, that wealth and ambition mattered more than fatherhood. Now, standing frozen in place, he realized how wrong he had been. "Mr. Caldwell?" Daniel's tone sharpened. Yes, of course," Ethan forced out, trying to focus. His gaze flickered back to Olivia and the boy, watching as they laughed together. A pang of regret clenched his chest. "Good. So we're agreed on the 15% stake?" Daniels confirmed. Ethan barely processed the question, his distracted mind automatically replying, "Yes." "Excellent. My legal team will finalize the paperwork immediately." The call ended, and cold realization struck Ethan like a punch to the gut. What had he just agreed to? His business instincts screamed that something was wrong. He replayed the conversation in his head, his stomach dropping. Had he just signed away a massive portion of his deal without even realizing it? His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Darren, his associate. Ethan hesitated, but finally picked up. "What the hell, Ethan?" Darren's voice was sharp. "Did you seriously just give away 15%? That's millions in lost revenue. What were you thinking?" Ethan's heart pounded. I made a mistake. We need to renegotiate. You think Daniels is going to let that slide? He has it in writing now." Ethan barely heard him. Across the plaza, Olivia and the boy were leaving, disappearing into the crowd. A desperate impulse took over. He started walking, following them at a distance, his pulse racing. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had built an empire, but in doing so had abandoned the one thing money couldn't buy, his family. As Darren's angry voice continued on the phone, Ethan wasn't listening anymore. His perfectly constructed world was beginning to crack. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure how to fix it. Ethan stared blankly at his phone, his grip tightening. The words from Darren still echoed in his mind. "It's too late, Ethan. Daniel's already signed. Do you have any idea what you just did?" His jaw clenched. Millions of dollars. Gone, because he had been too distracted by the past. The Ethan Caldwell of 10 years ago would have never made such a mistake. He had built his fortune on precision, on never losing focus. But today, his entire world had shifted in a matter of seconds. He shut his eyes briefly, trying to silence the storm of emotions threatening to consume him. The boy? The striking resemblance. Olivia. It was too much. He needed answers. Without overthinking, he pulled up an old contact and dialed. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Ethan Caldwell," the man on the other end said with a chuckle. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again." "Leo, I need your services." There was a brief pause before the private investigator spoke again. "Who are we looking into?" Ethan exhaled. "Olivia Hayes. And the boy with her." After giving the necessary details, Ethan ended the call. A heavy mix of anticipation and dread settled over him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what he might discover. Hours later, a manila folder lay on his desk. Ethan hesitated before flipping it open. The first few pages detailed Olivia's life after he left. His stomach twisted as he read about her struggles. How she lost her job due to complications with her pregnancy, how she barely made ends meet, and how she had nearly given up. His hands tightened around the pages as he reached the part that made his breath catch. She had almost put the baby up for adoption. She had gone as far as meeting with an agency. Ethan swallowed hard. His son, his own flesh and blood, could have been raised by strangers. And he never would have known. Flipping further, he found a name. Sophia Turner. According to the report, Sophia had found Olivia sitting on a park bench, sobbing days before the adoption papers were set to be signed. She had taken Olivia in, given her a home, and supported her through the darkest period of her life. Over time, the two women had built something extraordinary, a shelter for single mothers. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He had spent years assuming Olivia was fine without him, believing she was strong enough to handle anything. But the reality was far different. She had nearly lost everything, and yet she had built something remarkable from her pain. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir inside him, a need to make things right. He had walked away once. He wouldn't do it again. Ethan sat motionless in his chair, staring at the final pages of the report. The initial details had been painful enough. Olivia's struggles, her near homelessness, the agonizing decision to put their child up for adoption. But what came next sent a chill through him. Buried within the investigator's findings was something he never expected. His mother. Ethan had grown up believing his mother had died in a car accident when he was a boy. His father had told him the details so many times he had never questioned it. But the investigator's report showed no record of such an accident. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the documents again. Hospital records, death certificates, nothing lined up. And then one particular note caught his eye. A woman matching his mother's description had been seen at a small shelter in Chicago. A shelter, coincidentally, the same one Olivia had helped run. Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Had his father lied to him all these years? If so, why? What else had been kept from him? For years he had buried himself in success, believing money and power could fill the emptiness. Now, for the first time in decades, he felt like a child again, lost and searching for answers. Shaking off the emotions threatening to consume him, he picked up his phone. There was something he could do right now, something within his control. "Jeremy," he said when his accountant answered, "I need you to set up an anonymous donation." "To where?" "A shelter for single mothers, Chicago." There was a pause on the other end. "Any particular reason?" Ethan hesitated. "Just make sure it's untraceable." After finalizing the transaction, he leaned back, staring out over the city skyline. The guilt remained, heavier than before. He had abandoned his pregnant wife and unborn child for a dream of wealth, never once looking back. And yet, Olivia had turned her pain into something meaningful. She had built a sanctuary for women who had nowhere else to go. For the first time in years, admiration mixed with regret. Across town, Olivia sat in her office when her phone rang. It was the shelter's accountant. "Olivia, we just received a massive anonymous donation." Her eyebrows furrowed. "Anonymous?" "Yes, enough to fund operations for years." A slow sense of unease crept up her spine. No one had ever donated this much, especially without wanting recognition. And the timing, it didn't feel like a coincidence. She set the phone down and stared at the numbers on the screen. A name floated in the back of her mind, one she had spent years trying to forget. Ethan Caldwell. Had he finally come back? And if he had, what did he want? Ethan exhaled slowly as he tapped his fingers against the desk. His accountant's voice echoed through the speakerphone. "It's done, sir. The donation is completely untraceable." "Good," Ethan replied, his voice tight. "Keep me updated." He ended the call and leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the skyline beyond his office windows. He should have felt relief, maybe even satisfaction, but instead, there was only a gnawing uncertainty. Had he done this to help Olivia and the shelter? Or was this just a desperate attempt to ease his own guilt? Across town, Olivia sat at her desk, staring at the email notification about the massive donation. The amount was staggering, enough to fund the shelter for years. It should have been a moment of pure joy, but something about it felt off. She clicked through the transaction details, her instincts on high alert. Who would donate such a large sum without wanting recognition? "Sarah," Olivia called to her assistant. Sarah popped her head into the office. "Yeah? Can you look into this donation? See if there's any way to trace it back to the donor?" Sarah frowned. "You think there's a catch?" "I'm not sure," Olivia admitted, "but something about the timing feels too convenient." Meanwhile, Jake sat cross-legged on his bed, his laptop glowing in the dim light. For years, he had been curious about the father he never knew, but his mother had always dodged his questions. Tonight, he was done waiting for answers. As he absent-mindedly scrolled through company websites, an ad caught his attention. Caldwell Enterprises, summer internship program now open. His fingers hovered over the touchpad. It was one of the biggest real estate firms in the country, a name he had heard countless times in financial news reports. But more than that, something about the name Caldwell felt familiar. A plan began to form in his mind. If his mother wouldn't tell him the truth, maybe he could find it himself. "Hey, Mom," he called out, keeping his voice casual. "I think I found a summer internship I want to apply for." Olivia appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. "That's great, honey. Where is it?" Jake hesitated for a second. "Caldwell Enterprises. It's a huge company. Looks like a great opportunity." For the briefest moment, Olivia's face paled. It was so quick Jake almost missed it, but he saw it. Her reaction only confirmed his suspicions. "Sounds interesting," Olivia said after a pause. "Just make sure you explore all your options." Jake nodded, pretending to be uninterested. But as his mother walked away, he knew one thing for sure. She was hiding something. Ethan tapped his pen against his desk, staring at the latest reports on his screen. His focus kept drifting, his thoughts circling back to the shelter donation. He had told himself it was simply to ensure the funds were used properly. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the full truth. He was searching for any piece of Olivia's life that he had missed. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Caldwell, the summer internship applications are ready for review," his assistant Lisa said, handing him a stack of files. Ethan nodded, welcoming the distraction. "Thanks. Leave them here." As he flipped through the stack, a name jumped out at him. Jake Hayes. His breath caught in his throat. There was no way this was a coincidence. His pulse quickened as he scanned the application. Smart, ambitious, everything he had once hoped for in a son. He leaned back in his chair, gripping the paper tightly. Was Jake applying because he wanted to? Or was he searching for answers? Answers Olivia had refused to give him? Without allowing himself to hesitate, Ethan reached for the intercom. "Lisa, make sure Jake Hayes is on the shortlist for interviews." Across town, Olivia sat at her desk, staring at the donation confirmation. The money had saved the shelter from closing, but something about it didn't sit right. "Sarah," she called out. Her assistant peeked into the office. "Yeah? Any luck tracing the donation?" Sarah shook her head. "No name, no organization, just a massive wire transfer." Olivia's stomach twisted. Why now? After years of struggling, why would someone suddenly swoop in and help? The timing was too convenient. She exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temples. "Maybe it's time to tell Jake the truth," Sarah said softly. Olivia flinched. "I can't. There's so much he doesn't know." Sarah met her gaze. "But don't you think he deserves to?" Olivia swallowed hard. She had spent years protecting Jake from the truth. But was she only delaying the inevitable? Meanwhile, Jake stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt. His heart pounded, his thoughts racing. Tomorrow, he would walk into Caldwell Enterprises. Tomorrow, he might finally get the answers his mother had kept from him. He had studied the company inside and out, preparing every possible answer to interview questions. But the real reason he was going wasn't to land an internship. It was to look Ethan Caldwell in the eye and see for himself. At that moment, Olivia appeared in his doorway. "Ready for your interview?" "Yeah," Jake said, forcing a grin. "Should be interesting." As she left the room, his smile faded. He was finally going to meet the man his mother refused to talk about. And he wasn't leaving without the truth. Jake sat across from Ethan Caldwell, his hands resting on his lap, his heart pounding harder than he wanted to admit. He had prepared himself for a tense, cold interview, but to his surprise, Ethan seemed genuinely interested in his answers. Ethan skimmed over his resume, nodding slightly. "You have strong analytical skills. What made you interested in real estate development?" Jake leaned forward, forcing himself to focus. "I've always been fascinated by how cities evolve. I want to create spaces that improve people's lives." Ethan smiled, a flicker of recognition in his expression. "That's exactly how I felt at your age." Jake stiffened at the comment but quickly masked his reaction. How much did this man really know? "Well, Jake," Ethan said, closing the file, "I think you'd be a great addition to our team. When can you start?" Jake stood, shaking his hand. "I'll be ready right away." As he left the office, his thoughts spiraled. The interview had felt too personal, like Ethan wasn't just evaluating him as an intern, but as something more. Over the next few weeks, Ethan took Jake under his wing. The resemblance was undeniable, far beyond just physical features. Their thought processes mirrored each other. Jake's instincts in business were sharp, his problem-solving skills natural. Every time Ethan looked at him, he saw pieces of himself. Jake, on the other hand, felt his resentment slipping into something far more dangerous. Admiration? He had spent years resenting the father who abandoned his pregnant wife, convinced the man was selfish, heartless. But now, seeing Ethan's drive, his brilliance, his ability to see solutions no one else noticed, Jake couldn't deny that he respected him. But something still felt off. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied, Jake sat at his desk, scrolling through internal company reports. A series of transactions caught his eye, numbers that didn't quite add up, deals that seemed too good to be true. His gut twisted. Opening a restricted file, his breath caught. A pattern of money transfers, hidden accounts, something was wrong. "This can't be right," he whispered. Was Ethan involved in something illegal? Meanwhile, Ethan had his own moment of realization. During a casual conversation about family, Jake had mentioned something that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "June 15th, Jake had said. "We always celebrate my mom's birthday by watching the sunset at her favorite park." Ethan's stomach dropped. June 15th, the exact day he had walked away from Olivia. For the first time, the doubt crept in. Was it possible? Could this boy be his son? As the pieces slowly fell into place, both Ethan and Jake realized they were on a collision course, one that would change everything. Ethan sat at his desk, staring blankly at the city skyline. June 15th. Jake had mentioned it so casually, his mother's birthday, the tradition of watching the sunset. But for Ethan, that date was burned into his memory, the day he walked away. He ran a hand through his hair. Could this really be a coincidence? Or was it the missing confirmation of something he already suspected? Before he could dwell on it further, a voice caught his attention. "Don't worry, Mom. I haven't forgotten why I'm here." Ethan froze. Jake stood just outside his office, phone pressed to his ear. His tone was calm, but something about his words made Ethan's stomach tighten. What did he mean by that? Before Ethan could confront him, his office door swung open. "We need to talk," Darren, his longtime business partner, said, his voice low. "It's about the new intern." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What about him?" Darren shut the door, glancing around before lowering his voice. "There's something off about this kid. He's been asking too many questions, poking around in places he shouldn't be." Ethan forced himself to stay composed. "He's ambitious. That's why I hired him." Darren shook his head. "It's more than that. He's digging, Ethan, looking into things that don't concern him. We need to keep an eye on him." As Darren left, Ethan sank into his chair. He had wanted to get close to Jake, to make amends for the past. But now that closeness threatened to destroy everything. Across the office, Jake sat at his desk, his eyes locked on his laptop screen. The files he had uncovered weren't just unusual, they were illegal. Money transfers, hidden accounts, fraud. The evidence pointed to something much bigger than he had imagined. And the worst part? It all led back to Ethan Caldwell. His hands clenched into fists. He had started this internship to find answers about his father, not to expose a scandal. But now, the truth was right in front of him, and he didn't know what to do with it. Meanwhile, Darren's suspicions were growing. He sat in his office, pulling up a search on Jake Hayes. If the kid was sniffing around where he shouldn't be, it was time to find out exactly who he was. Back in Ethan's office, he watched Jake leave for the night. A strange mix of emotions churned in his gut: pride, regret, and an increasing sense of dread. He was running out of time. Soon, he would have to make a choice: protect his empire or embrace the son he never knew he wanted. And either way, everything was about to come crashing down. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration tightening his chest. Something wasn't adding up. The numbers in the financial reports didn't match. Transfers had been disguised, payments funneled through offshore accounts. It was all too clean, too intentional. Before he could process it fully, his office door swung open. "Working late again?" Darren's voice carried a smug edge as he strolled in. "You should really learn to delegate more." Ethan looked up, his expression grim. "We need to talk." Darren arched an eyebrow. "Sounds serious." "I found discrepancies," Ethan said, sliding the reports across the desk. "The kind that could land us both in prison." Darren's smirk faded. "Now, Ethan, let's not be dramatic." "Dramatic?" Ethan scoffed. "Bribes, kickbacks, money laundering. How long has this been going on?" Darren's expression darkened. "Business is complicated, you know that. Complicated is one thing, illegal is another." Their voices rose, tension crackling between them. Neither of them noticed the figure standing just outside the office, listening. Jake had been passing by when he caught his father's voice. Something about the tone made him stop. "You really want to go down this road, Ethan?" Darren's voice dropped to a warning tone. "Remember, your hands aren't exactly clean either." Ethan's stomach clenched. "That real estate deal in Chicago? The zoning changes in Miami? I've got enough on you to take you down with me." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He had justified those actions as necessary evils. But now they felt like chains tightening around his throat. Outside the office, Jake pressed his back against the wall, his mind spinning. He had suspected corruption at Caldwell Enterprises, but this? His father wasn't just complicit, he was part of it. Darren straightened his tie, his smirk returning. "So what's it gonna be, partner?" Ethan's hands curled into fists. He had built this empire from the ground up, poured everything into it. The thought of losing it all was unbearable. But could he live with himself if he let this continue? For the next few days, he buried himself in the numbers. The deeper he dug, the worse it got. The corruption wasn't limited to a few bad deals. It ran through every level of the company. There were shell companies, fraudulent invoices, hidden accounts moving millions of dollars. And Darren wasn't working alone. Ethan uncovered ties to powerful figures, not just businessmen, but politicians. The kind of people who could erase problems or create them. Meanwhile, Jake had changed. He was more reserved, watching Ethan closely. His usual sharp questions laced with something else. Distrust. Had he overheard something? The thought filled Ethan with dread. Because if Jake had discovered the truth, then everything was about to fall apart. Jake hesitated outside Ethan Caldwell's office, gripping the file in his hands. Every instinct told him to walk away, to pretend he hadn't seen what he had, but he couldn't ignore it. Steeling himself, he knocked. Ethan looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Jake, come in." Jake stepped inside, setting the folder down. "I've been running some projections and something doesn't add up." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Go on." "The revenue reports. Certain numbers don't make sense unless—" Jake hesitated. "Unless what?" Ethan asked, forcing his voice to stay calm. Jake met his gaze. "Unless something not entirely legal is happening." The accusation hung in the air between them. Ethan studied the boy in front of him, his son, though Jake didn't know it yet. The same determination, the same hunger for truth that Ethan himself once had. His jaw tightened. How much had Jake uncovered? "Business isn't always as simple as it looks in textbooks," Ethan said carefully. "Sometimes things are complicated." Jake exhaled, frustration flickering across his face. "I get that, but this looks like fraud." Ethan forced a calm smile. "Focus on your work. Learn what you can. But trust me, there are some things that are better left alone." Jake nodded, but Ethan saw the doubt in his eyes. As Jake walked out, Ethan sank back into his chair. He had protected his company, but at what cost? That night, unable to ignore the truth any longer, Ethan reached for his phone. "Leo, it's me. I need your help." The private investigator sighed. "I had a feeling you'd call. What's the job?" Ethan exhaled sharply. "This time, I need you to look into my own company, and be careful, this goes deeper than I ever imagined." As he ended the call, a cold realization settled over him. He had built Caldwell Enterprises from nothing, but had he lost control of it? The next morning, Ethan stood outside a familiar building. He adjusted the baseball cap on his head, pushing open the door to Olivia's shelter. The world she had built without him. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet activity. Women chatted in small groups. Children played in a corner. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a home. His gaze swept the room until it landed on Olivia. She stood near the reception desk, talking to one of the volunteers, unaware of his presence. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like an outsider in a life that could have been his, and he wasn't sure if he had the right to step back in. Ethan scanned the shelter, his heart pounding as he searched for a familiar face. "Can I help you?" He turned, and for a moment the air was sucked from his lungs. The woman standing before him had streaks of gray in her hair, her face lined with age, but he would recognize those eyes anywhere. "Mom?" The word left his lips before he could stop himself. Margaret's breath hitched. "Ethan?" Before either could react, he grabbed her arm and guided her toward a quiet corner. "What are you doing here?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I thought you were dead." Margaret's eyes filled with sorrow. "I never wanted to leave you, but I had no choice." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him as she spoke. She told him everything, the years of abuse, the fear that had driven her to fake her death. His hands clenched into fists. "Then why didn't you take me with you?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Your father threatened to kill you if I ever tried." I thought you'd be safer if I was gone." Ethan's breath came in short, uneven gasps. The man he had spent his entire life trying to impress, the father whose approval he had chased relentlessly, had been a monster. A few feet away, Olivia stepped into the shelter. She paused, her gaze locking onto Ethan. Something about him stirred a distant memory, but she couldn't quite place it. With a small shake of her head, she turned to Margaret. "Do you have a moment?" Olivia asked. "I wanted to go over the donation again." Margaret gave Ethan a quick, meaningful glance before following Olivia toward the office. Ethan didn't wait. He slipped out of the shelter, his mind in turmoil. He had come here looking for answers about Olivia and Jake. Instead, he had unearthed a secret that shattered his entire past. Across town, Jake sat at his desk in Caldwell Enterprises, flipping through old records. Something wasn't adding up. He had been digging into the company's history, piecing together timelines and names. But now, a possibility he had never considered was staring him in the face. Could Ethan Caldwell be his father? Later that night, Olivia sat alone in her office, staring at an old photograph of Jake as a baby. The weight of the past pressed heavily on her. She had never told Jake how close she had come to giving him up for adoption. The fear, the desperation, it was a chapter of their history she had fought to bury. But some truths refused to stay hidden. Olivia stared at her screen, her pulse quickening as she read the latest email. The investigator had finally traced the donation. The funds led back to a shell company, and beyond that, Caldwell Enterprises. Her breath caught in her throat. Could it really be him after all these years? Across town, in his high-rise office, Darren poured himself a drink, a smug smile curling on his lips. He had been digging, watching, connecting the dots between Ethan, Olivia, and Jake. Now, he had leverage. The kind that could bring Ethan to his knees. "Oh, Ethan," he muttered, "you've been very, very careless." As the city lights flickered, 4 people lay awake, each haunted by their own demons. Ethan wrestled with his mother's revelations, the abuse, the lies, the realization that he had spent his life mirroring the very man he despised. Margaret, torn between guilt and the desperate hope of reclaiming the son she lost. Olivia, on the edge of uncovering a truth that could shatter everything. And Jake, terrified yet drawn to the growing suspicion that Ethan Caldwell was more than just his employer. The past was unraveling, and no one was prepared for what was coming. Ethan tossed in bed, his mother's voice echoing in his mind. How much of his father lived inside him? His ruthless ambition, his obsession with power. Had he unknowingly become the very thing he had spent his life outrunning? "I have to break this cycle," he murmured. But could he? His last thought before exhaustion claimed him was of Jake. Could he still be the father he never had? The morning sun barely crept through the blinds of Ethan's office when his door burst open. Jake stormed in, face flushed with anger, voice shaking. "We need to talk." Ethan sat up straight. He had been dreading this moment. "About what?" he asked carefully. Jake slammed a file onto the desk. "The company's finances, the fake accounts, the bribes." Ethan's stomach twisted. "I saw the documents," Jake continued, his hands clenching into fists. "How could you be involved in something like this?" Ethan felt every instinct urging him to deflect, to justify. He had spent years building an empire of wealth and influence, but now, looking at Jake, his son, though Jake still didn't know it, he realized none of it mattered. He exhaled slowly, meeting Jake's gaze. "You're right," Ethan said. And for the first time in his life, he knew he couldn't lie. Ethan exhaled, his voice low. "Jake, things have gotten out of control. I never meant for it to be this way. I'm trying to fix it." Jake's expression hardened. "Fix it? How? By covering it up?" Before Ethan could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. "Olivia?" His pulse quickened as he answered. "Ethan, it's me. We need to talk about the donation." His grip tightened on the phone. "Olivia, I can explain." "So it was you." Her voice held a mix of shock and anger. "Why now, after all these years?" Ethan searched for the right words, but before he could speak, the door burst open. Darren strolled in, eyes glinting with satisfaction. Well, isn't this a nice little family reunion?" Jake's head snapped toward Ethan. His face went pale. "Family?" Silence crashed over the room. Darren smirked. "Oh, come on, Ethan. The kid's smart enough to figure it out. He's your son, isn't he?" Ethan stood, hands shaking. "Darren, that's enough." Darren chuckled. "Oh, it's far from enough. I know everything about Olivia, about Jake, about your past." His voice darkened. "One word from me, and it all comes crashing down." Ethan clenched his jaw. "What do you want?" Darren leaned in. "Simple. You take the fall for the company's creative accounting, and I walk away clean. If you refuse, I expose everything." Jake's gaze darted between them, his world spinning. "You're blackmailing him? And you're actually considering it?" Ethan closed his eyes for a long moment, the weight of every lie, every decision suffocating him. When he opened them, he didn't just see Jake, he saw himself, years ago, desperate for the truth. He turned back to Darren, voice firm. "No more lies, no more cover-ups." Darren's smirk faded. "You're bluffing." "I'm not," Ethan said. "It's over. I'm coming clean." Darren's face twisted with rage. "You'll regret this." He spun on his heel and stormed out. Silence filled the space between Ethan and Jake. Jake swallowed hard. "Is it true? Are you really my father?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, and I'm so sorry, Jake, for everything." Jake stood frozen, emotions warring in his expression. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. Ethan slumped into his chair, his world crumbling around him. His phone buzzed again. "Olivia." He took a deep breath and answered. "Olivia, there's a lot I need to tell you." "Can we meet?" Across town, Olivia hung up, her mind racing. Ethan. The man she had fought to forget was back. And worse, he had been the one behind the anonymous donation. What did it mean for her? For Jake? Tension simmered throughout the day. Jake avoided Ethan at work, resentment and confusion battling inside him. Olivia prepared for her meeting, anger and memories from the past colliding in her chest. Meanwhile, in his penthouse office, Darren paced. He wasn't going down without a fight. As the evening approached, Ethan made a choice. He would confess everything at the upcoming charity gala. The corruption, his past with Olivia, his relationship to Jake. No more secrets. Taking a deep breath, he reached for his phone. "Margaret," he said when his mother picked up, his voice heavy, "I need your help." The night before the gala, tension gripped them all. Ethan wrote his confession, knowing it could cost him everything. Jake wrestled with the truth about his father, torn between anger and curiosity. Olivia prepared for a confrontation she had avoided for years. And Darren, desperate, set his final plan into motion. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city. The stage was set. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning of the gala, the air was thick with unease. Ethan sat at his desk, pen poised over a blank page. "How do you confess to years of deception?" "I've made mistakes," he wrote. Then, shaking his head, he crossed it out. Too simple, too empty. Across town, Darren hunched over his computer, a twisted grin spreading across his face. He had spent the night digging, and he had found gold. Not only did he have enough evidence to bury Ethan, but he had something on Olivia too. He printed the documents, scanning them with satisfaction. A few financial discrepancies. Nothing significant, but twisted the right way, it could look like fraud. Meanwhile, Olivia paced her living room, the invitation to the gala sitting untouched on her coffee table. Could she face Ethan again? "Mom?" Jake's voice pulled her back. He stood in the doorway, his expression carefully guarded. "Are we going to this thing?" She studied his face, seeing the same conflict she felt reflected in his eyes. "I don't know, honey." Jake shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "I mean, do you want to?" "It's for the shelter, right?" Jake adjusted his tie, avoiding his mother's gaze. "We should go. It's not about him." But they both knew that was a lie. Across the city, Margaret stood in front of the mirror, her fingers trembling. She took a breath, practicing the words she had long feared to say. "I'm Margaret Caldwell," she whispered to her reflection. "Ethan's mother." The name felt foreign on her tongue, but for the first time in decades, it felt right. As the day stretched on, Ethan surprised himself. The decision to come clean, though terrifying, brought a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. His phone buzzed. A message from Leo, his investigator. "Found something about Olivia. You should know." Ethan clicked on the attachment. As he read, his stomach twisted. Olivia had nearly given Jake up for adoption. He had judged her for so long, never knowing how close she had come to making the same choice he had. Meanwhile, Darren leaned back in his chair, reviewing the final pieces of his plan. Timing was everything. As soon as Ethan confessed, he'd release the information about Olivia's supposed fraud. One move. 2 lives ruined. At sunset, Jake stood in front of his closet, staring at the suit he hadn't worn in years. A part of him wanted to skip the gala altogether, to avoid Ethan, avoid whatever truths were about to be exposed. But another part of him, one he barely wanted to acknowledge, was curious. What would Ethan say? What secrets had been buried all this time? A soft knock at his door. "Jake," Olivia said, "we should leave soon, if we're going." He inhaled deeply. "Yeah, Mom, I'll be ready in a minute." Olivia nodded, but her hands gripped the doorknob tightly. She had no idea what Ethan was planning to reveal, but she knew one thing. Tonight would change everything. At the shelter, Margaret helped with the final preparations, her nerves barely contained. Tonight, she would reunite with her son. She would finally have a chance to explain, to make amends. As the sky darkened, Ethan stood in his office, staring out over the city that had made him powerfully destroyed him. Every lie, every betrayal, every lost year with his son had led to this moment. His phone buzzed. "Darren. Last chance, Ethan. Back out now, or I release everything." Ethan didn't hesitate. He deleted the message. There was no going back. As the first guests arrived at the gala, Ethan stepped out of his car, straightening his tie. It was time. Ethan straightened his tie as he stepped out of his car. Tonight, everything would come to light. A few minutes later, Olivia and Jake arrived, both tense but resolute. Across the venue, Darren slipped through a side entrance, a folder tucked under his arm, a weapon designed to destroy reputations. And finally, Margaret took a steadying breath before stepping inside. Tonight, she would no longer be a secret. The gala buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, but beneath the glamour, tension crackled. Ethan moved through the crowd, nodding to familiar faces, but his focus remained on the podium. Then, his eyes met Olivia's. For a fleeting second, everything else faded. The past, the betrayals, the choices that had led them here. He turned to the microphone, gripping the edges of the podium. "Good evening, everyone. I have something important to share." The crowd quieted. "For years," he began, voice steady, "I've built this empire. But I haven't done it honestly." As Ethan continued, Darren weaved through the guests, smirking as he approached Olivia. "Mrs. Hayes," he murmured, handing her a file. "I think you'll find this enlightening." Olivia's hands shook as she flipped through the documents. Her breath caught. "This isn't possible." Meanwhile, Jake stood frozen, eyes locked on Ethan. The man he had started to respect was confessing to crimes. His stomach twisted. Had everything been a lie? Without thinking, Jake stepped forward. His voice cut through the silence. "How could you?" Ethan stopped mid-sentence. "You're nothing but a fraud," Jake continued, voice shaking. "You pretended to be this great leader, this mentor, but you're just another criminal." The room gasped. Murmurs spread like wildfire. "Is that his son?" someone whispered. "I didn't know Caldwell had a child." Olivia rushed to Jake's side, trying to calm him, but as she did, her gaze landed on Ethan. Her breath hitched. "You," she whispered. Realization dawned. "You were the mysterious donor." Ethan stepped down from the podium, his confession momentarily forgotten. "Why?" Olivia's voice wavered, equal parts anger and disbelief. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, the damage had already been done. In the face of this confrontation, "Olivia, I can explain," Ethan said, his voice low. "Explain what?" Olivia snapped. "How you walked away. How you suddenly decided to show up and play the hero." As tension crackled between them, Darren saw his opportunity slipping away. He grabbed the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice smooth yet menacing. "Since we're all being honest, let me share some truths about our dear Olivia and her so-called charitable shelter." Before he could continue, Margaret pushed through the crowd. "That's enough," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I won't let you destroy this family any further." The room fell silent. "Who is she?" someone murmured. Margaret took a steadying breath. "I'm Margaret Caldwell, Ethan's mother." Gasps echoed through the hall. Ethan turned to her, his mind reeling. He had known she was alive, but seeing her here standing before him was something else entirely. "Mom?" he whispered. Margaret began to speak, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. She told them everything, the abuse, the threats, why she had disappeared. The crowd listened in stunned silence. Ethan felt something shift inside him. The years of anger and resentment began to fade, replaced by something new, understanding. Across the room, Jake and Olivia exchanged a glance, their own frustrations momentarily forgotten. Darren, watching his plan unravel, made one last desperate attempt. "This is all very touching," he sneered, "but it doesn't change the fact that Olivia has been embezzling from the shelter." Olivia's breath caught. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Darren waved a folder in the air. "I have proof right here." Ethan's expression darkened as he stepped forward. "No, you don't, Darren." His voice was cold, controlled. "Those documents are fake, and you know it." Darren's face paled. "How did you?" "I've known about your schemes for weeks," Ethan said. "I was just too much of a coward to stop you, until now." Darren stammered, but the weight of Ethan's words crushed any attempt at a response. Jake, watching his father stand his ground, felt something unexpected stir inside him. Maybe Ethan wasn't who he thought he was. Olivia, still processing the chaos, turned to Ethan. "Why didn't you tell me about the donation? About everything?" Ethan met her gaze. "I was ashamed, Olivia, of what I'd done, of who I'd become. I thought I could make amends without facing you." He swallowed hard. "I was wrong." The weight of the truth settled over the room. Ethan exhaled and turned back to the crowd. "I've made terrible mistakes. I've hurt people I love. I've broken laws." He looked at Olivia, Jake, and his mother. "But first, I need to make things right." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "This is Ethan Caldwell," he said into the phone. "I'd like to turn myself in for financial fraud and corporate corruption." Chaos erupted. Olivia grabbed his arm. "Ethan, What are you doing? What I should have done years ago. His voice was calm, resolute, taking responsibility for my actions. As security arrived to escort him out, Ethan turned back to the faces in the crowd. Olivia, Jake, his mother. "I'm sorry for everything," he said. "I hope one day you'll be able to forgive me." Then he was gone. The gala had transformed into something none of them expected. By the end of the night, they all knew nothing would ever be the same. Days later, Ethan stood in a federal courtroom, shoulders squared. Despite everything, he held his head high. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady, "I am here to confess to years of financial fraud, bribery, and corruption." The room fell silent. He spoke of falsified records, illegal business deals, the lies he had built his empire upon. With every admission, he felt both relief and regret. "I take full responsibility for these actions," he concluded. "No one else should suffer for my mistakes." The judge's gavel slammed down. 5 years in federal prison. As the officers approached with handcuffs, Ethan's eyes found Olivia, Jake, and Margaret in the gallery. Shock, pain, something else he couldn't quite name. Was it respect? Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Mr. Cop Caldwell, did you really turn yourself in? What about your family? Is it true you've been living a double life?" Olivia pushed through the crowd, shielding Jake from the cameras. Margaret followed, her gaze locked on Ethan as he was led to a waiting police car. The next morning, newspapers across the country ran the story. Billionaire tycoon confesses to corporate fraud. Ethan's face was everywhere. His fall from grace dissected by analysts and reporters eager for scandal. In the quiet of their home, Olivia and Jake sat in stunned silence, trying to process it all. "Why did he do it?" Jake asked, voice small. "Why did he turn himself in?" Olivia sighed. I think he was trying to protect us, in his own way." Jake nodded, his emotions tangled. Anger, confusion, and a reluctant sense of admiration. "Do you think we should visit him?" Olivia hesitated. "Let's give it some time," she said finally. "We all need to process this." Across town, Margaret sat alone in her small apartment, staring at an old photo of the son she had lost and the man he had become. Margaret sat alone in her apartment, flipping through an old photo album. Her fingers traced the faded image of a young Ethan, his eyes bright with ambition. "I should have been there," she whispered. "Maybe things would have been different." As the weeks passed, the effects of Ethan's confession rippled through the community. At first, Olivia's shelter faced scrutiny. The scandal threatened to shut its doors for good until an unexpected wave of support flooded in. People saw Ethan's attempt at redemption and responded with generosity. Donations poured in. Olivia threw herself into keeping the shelter afloat, fielding endless questions about Ethan Caldwell. What surprised her most was how often she found herself defending him. Jake, meanwhile, buried himself in his studies, struggling to make sense of his feelings. To his own surprise, he started spending time at the shelter. Helping others seemed to quiet the storm inside him. 3 months into Ethan's sentence, Olivia and Jake finally made their first visit to the prison. The sight of Ethan in a jumpsuit, his face lined with exhaustion, hit them harder than they expected. "I'm so sorry," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Olivia nodded, unable to find words. Jake hesitated, then slowly reached out and squeezed his father's hand. As they left the prison, neither spoke, but something had shifted. The anger and resentment weren't gone, but for the first time, forgiveness didn't seem impossible. Margaret visited Ethan often. Their conversations, once strained, began to carry warmth. They talked about the past, the choices that shaped them, and the future Ethan was trying to build. 6 months in, Ethan received unexpected news. Because of his cooperation in exposing larger corruption networks, his sentence was reduced. He would be released in just a few months. Reactions were mixed. Some called it justice served, while others criticized the system for favoring the wealthy. To Ethan, it was a second chance, one he wasn't sure he deserved. As his release date approached, Ethan reflected on the road that had brought him here. The lies, betrayals, and damage he had caused, but also the confession, the truth, and his effort to make things right. He thought of Olivia and Jake, of his mother, and the community he had both harmed and helped. That night, lying in his prison cell, Ethan stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, he would step back into the world, a changed man. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding trust, proving himself, it would take time. But as Ethan Caldwell stood at the gates of Maplewood Correctional Facility, breathing in the cold morning air, he felt something he hadn't in years: hope. The price of redemption had been high, but as he stepped forward, he knew one thing: it had been worth it. A month later, Ethan found himself standing at the entrance of Olivia's shelter, his heart hammering. It was his first day as a volunteer. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. Conversations quieted, heads turned, whispers spread. Across the room, Olivia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "I need to make things right. Let me start here." She studied him for a long moment, then handed him a mop. "The kitchen needs cleaning." He got to work. Every movement felt heavy under the weight of suspicious glances and quiet judgment. He didn't blame them. He had a long way to go. Weeks passed. The tension didn't disappear overnight, but little by little, it softened. Ethan took on every task: cleaning, repairs, unloading donations. No job was beneath him. One evening, as he grabbed his coat to leave, a longtime volunteer stopped him. "You know," she said, "you're not what I expected." Ethan smiled, a small victory. At home, things were more complicated. Jake, now in college, was adjusting to life on his own. Despite the distance, an unspoken question lingered between them. Could they ever be father and son? Ethan knew he couldn't force an answer. All he could do was keep proving he was a different man. This story is more than just about redemption and second chances. It's about the choices we make and whether we have the courage to own our mistakes and change. Ethan had every reason to keep running from his past, but he didn't. He faced his failures head-on, knowing that rebuilding trust wasn't about words, but about consistent actions over time. That's the biggest lesson here. Redemption isn't given, it's earned. Think about your own life. Have you ever made a mistake that felt impossible to come back from? Have you ever hurt someone, intentionally or not, and wondered if you could ever fix it? The truth is, people don't expect perfection, but they do expect honesty and effort. So here's my challenge to you. If there's a relationship in your life that needs repairing, take the first step. Maybe it's apologizing, maybe it's showing up consistently, maybe it's simply being better than you were yesterday. Change won't happen overnight, but every small effort matters. What do you think? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to rebuild trust? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more powerful stories that inspire real change. Let me know if you want a different angle or deeper analysis.